Steve Scalise backing out of the race for Speaker highlights the turmoil within the Republican Party.
Chris Welty joins us now with more.
Lee Meg, Dillard University political analyst Dr. Robert Collins initially expected a quick vote for Congressman Steve Scalise to become the next Speaker of the House, but it soon became clear that it would be an uphill battle. Roughly 20 Republicans did not want Scalise to be the next House Speaker. For much of the day, Scalise spent time meeting with the holdouts. In addition, several lawmakers and former President Donald Trump raised concerns over Scalise's cancer diagnosis. Dr. Collins says Scalise is politically savvy and knew that he would not be able to garner enough support, so instead of delaying the process, he did what he felt was best and dropped out. Collins believes Scalise will remain the majority leader.
He will just stay in that position as long as the Republicans have the majority in the House. And of course, from that position, he can continue to do good things for Louisiana and help to get infrastructure funding and those sort of things. So I think in the short-term future, he's simply going to stay as the majority leader of the House.
Dr. Collins does not expect a new House Speaker to be elected this week. He says Republicans will begin feeling pressure to elect a new leader because of the war in Israel and to avoid a government shutdown in a few weeks. Collins says it might be a challenge for Republicans to elect a new House Speaker, considering how a small group was able to oust Kevin McCarthy. Lee, Meg.